Hey, true believers. Chris Mack coming at you with Uncanny X-Men 348. And looking back at this time period, I remember when these books, this particular arc started coming out, I wasn't interested in it at the time. But, you know, through the gift of hindsight, I have to say I definitely miss these days. And one thing that I will say that I miss about these days, $1.99 compared to how most books nowadays are like, what, $4, $5, $6, even $8. They're just kind of like new. So with that said, let's dive into issue 348. The print date on this was October 1997. Though one thing that I was fond about this time is when you opened it, they started doing the previously on, but it was like a fold out. So not only did you get like a read up, but you also got like photos to kind of at least bring you up quick on how what's been happening. Now, this was kind of like all over the place in a sense. The X-Men ended up in space. They thankfully returned after, I think it was like a battle with the Shi'ar. Magneto's not Magneto. He's apparently named Joseph at this time period, if you all remember. All parts of him being Magneto are gone. And then Bishop ended up lost in space with Deathbird. So, yeah, it was kind of like this big grandiose thing that Liddell was working on. Now, when the X-Men returned to Earth, they've been gone for a while. Everyone thought they were dead. And everyone thinks that Bishop and Deathbird died to bring everyone back here. Remy ends up running into two mercenaries that he'd worked with before. Her name's Spat, and I'm not 100% sure what her name was. Let me see if it tells you. Grovel, there it is. And they find Magneto's old Antarctic base, and it's being run by Nanny. Now, Nanny, I think it was X-Men 113, way back in the day. Magneto captured the X-Men. Nanny was their charge, and she treated them like children. I can't remember if she actually turned them into children or not, but yeah, she was a psycho. I liked her more in the Age of Apocalypse, where she's a little more sweet and vicious as hell, if you guys have read the Age of Apocalypse. And yeah, I mean, look at that. Right off the bat, you get stakes. There's all these mechanical beasts coming to attack them. So it just kind of, to me, was like, all right, this is weird. But one thing that I liked, even though nobody liked Joseph, I was one of them. In a sense, it lets Magneto see his life through a different lens. Now, spoiler alert, if you've never read any of these, this is not Magneto. He was a clone. And even though Scott Liddell was working on this character, it's weird how here in this issue, I'll explain when we get in there, but like he'll have like these sort of surfacing memories or emotions, but then you'll go over to X-Men or something like that, and then it just kind of contradicts itself. So it just seems like there was no communication through the X books, and during this time, there was a whole hell of a lot of them. So before we move forward, people responsible for this was Liddell writing, Maduria doing pencils, excuse me, Townsend, Haldrake, and Vane doing inks, Digital Chameleon doing colors, Starkings, Comicraft doing lettering, and then here's everyone else that was working on the book. So this arc was called Because I Said So, and this led up to what was called the Trial of Gambit, and we'll talk about more of that in a minute. So here, Gambit saying, I was just this minute going to tell you, it seems she somehow has the ability to put our whammy on our mutant powers. And Rogue's just like, how is that possible? According to our records, when the X-Men were held captive by Nanny, their powers were negated with neural inhibitors implanted in their restraints. So here, this is where it references Uncanny X-Men 113, but I like that it shows that Nanny has upgraded. So kind of like a Terminator, she learns. So even though this is leading up, like, again, one thing that I think was going against Scott Liddell during his time with the X-Men is he did his best to try to keep his plot coherent, But I think Marvel was throwing too many events at him. There were too many books. Like, for example, when we went over the Onslaught event, you know, he just kind of brought up that he wanted to do something called Onslaught, and they turned it into this huge thing. So he's trying to juggle all these X books to kind of be coherent, trying to kind of keep somewhat of an original vision, and he did his best. His books were entertaining, but you can kind of tell where things began to drop. Like, you know, in this book particular, Trish Tilby is in here, and they're supposed to be the, you know, her and Beast are in a relationship, but it doesn't really follow anything like that. Same here, where Deathbird actually shows how Gambit survived the time and space, and then instead of kind of following it in a book, this book, they went and started a whole another book. I can't remember what it's called. It was short-lived, and I'm kind of curious to see what it was about, but again, you only get maybe 2 pages with Deathbird and Gambit, or Deathbird and Bishop. But this book is primarily supposed to be focusing on Gambit and Rogue's relationship and how these bounty hunters were hired to capture him. They won't tell him who the mysterious benefactor is, but what I like here is how Rogue really starts to seem distant. And Remy goes, "Cher, are you all right?" And then just out of the blue, she visually, like physically, changes. She goes, "Off." I said, "Take your filthy hands off me, punk. Essex paid you big time to do your job, and you did it. Now back off, or so help me, your guts are going to be hanging all over these tunnel walls." And that look of realization and shock on Gambit's face is what pays it off, because it hits him. Because what it starts to allude to is why Rogue's powers are turned off. All these memories of people that she's absorbed through the years are kind of starting to surface, particularly Gambit's. If we go back to pre-Age of Apocalypse, when the world was getting ready to be frozen over with the Omicron crystal, her and Gambit decide to have a kiss, since they were never able to be touching each other, and since they figured they were going to die, they embrace and kiss. And that's when the Age of Apocalypse started. And then X-Men Prime, it shows that Rogue has put Gambit in a coma. She takes off to parts unknown, and she kind of starts acting like Remy. You know, she starts having the eyes, and I think she was able to use his kinetic powers at that time. But here, all his memories start to surface, so all his sins of his past begin to catch up with him. Now, going back to Bishop, Joseph, you know, he's trying to tell Nanny to let him go, and she's really acting psycho. Like, if you actually read through the whole dialogue, you're just kind of like, wow, this is one crazy fucked up robot I do not want to be around. But anyway, here again, talking about cramming too much, Nanny starts bringing Joseph up to current events. These are the events happening in X-Men and Wolverine, but it starts talking about Operation Zero Tolerance, what they kind of began building up way back in X-Men Prime, along with Onslaught. So right there, Marvel wanted 2 events, because like right after Onslaught ended, then they did Operation Zero Tolerance. So, you know, what's his name? Liddell, not being able to really make any standalone books, he just kept getting smacked with all these events. And here you can see how he's trying to cram it all together here and make it make sense. Now, again, here Joseph sees the image of Moira McTaggart, and it says, for the first time he can recall since the moment he awoken in a Guatemalan prison, weak and amnesiac, which was the first appearance of Joseph, was Uncanny X-Men 327. It says he's experiencing an emotion he cannot explain. A need for vengeance. And here during this time, they didn't really explore this anymore from what I remember. After Liddell left, you know, Marvel wanted to wrap up the whole thing with the legacy virus, and that's when we get Colossus killed off, spoiler alert, and they killed off Moira McTaggart. So I don't think this was ever explored. And when I was reading the trivia about this, they said a lot of writers never really went back to this time period, which I can understand. But at least it was fun. Like, for example, Beast didn't get caught by Nanny. And listen to how Beast talks here. He says, "It's a wonder I dated all." So maybe that's not the most relevant thought I could have had at this moment, but it's honest. Every time I manage to convince myself that my merry mutant mates and I are entitled to a real life, a life in which we get at least to attempt to enjoy the world we so often try to save, despite what seems like its best efforts to the contrary, something like this happens to remind everyone involved of the fatal flaw in that theory. We aren't normal. And he's talking about how, started out as a simple date between him and Trish. They went out to space, which made me to the realization there must be something majorly maladjusted with anyone who consent to fall in love with me. Irresistibility notwithstanding. So I like that even though he's in the midst of this, crisis with his teammates, he's still able to joke and kind of keep a little bit of levity. That's why when I go over the modern Krakoa books, I hate what Beast has become. Especially if we go back and read the last, if we look at the last review we did of X-Force, and the back and forth between him and Jean, those are not the X-Men that I know and love. They are definitely pod people. Now again, going back to how Liddell was trying to cram too much at once, all through Uncanny X-Men, like apparently Betsy and Archangel had their own little miniseries that was called, what was it called? I don't remember. But here, real quick, even the editor says, see X-Men 67 for this event that happened with Iceman. And he says, maybe there are too many X titles. And again, during the 90s, they really pumped these books out like crazy. I mean, what was it? Back in the day, we had X-Men, Wolverine, Excalibur, and New Mutants. And then they killed off New Mutants, did X-Force, X-Factor, Generation X, and the list kept going on. And I think that's why there for a while the X-Men just kind of got boring, because you come into a book and they're like, oh, see this event. Well, why the hell did I even bother picking up this one if all it is just kind of like a recap? It's just frustrating. So, and that's what kind of suffers with Archangel and Betsy, is you want to know more about them, but then you have to ask yourself, do I really want to pick up another book? Like, as you go through, like, I appreciate that they always give you like the little X to tell you what books, where these events happen, but as you go through this one, there's a whole lot of tiny dots. Now, to kind of move forward with Rogue, she gets progressively worse. And after the outburst that we see that Remy begins to sulk instead of trying to get everyone to escape. And Spats, knows a lot about Gambit's past, and she's trying to goad him. And he's like, who hired you? And she's like, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. So, this thing, I feel like this book got a little too cramped with all these other things that they're trying to do with Bishop and Deathbird, Archangel, and Betsy. I feel like if they would have just stayed on Rogue and Gambit and Joseph through this would have been a very interesting book. But again, trying to do too much too quick really kind of sullied this moment where Gambit tells Rogue, I'm tired of my past always haunt me. You need to trust me and not worry about these memories that are surfacing with you. Right now, we're depowered. This is our last night together. Can we please enjoy it? And I like how it just bittersweetly ends with them embracing. Now, the reason that I say that it's too bloated is the next issue. You're wanting to know how Rogue and Gambit and everyone's going to get out of this. But from what memory serves, is there's a moment in this book where Psylocke disappears, and it doesn't explain how she got away, blah, 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 blah. But the next book jumps between this big fight between her and Maggot, and then cutting back to these two. I really feel like when they started doing the trial of Gambit, it should have stayed focused on them and not taken away from the emotional impact of what happens in 350, because these two have been lovers for years and years and years, and everyone wants to see what their fate was going to be. And it just got too sidetracked from having too many fingers in the pie. But again, as I said at the beginning, looking back at this with, kind of hindsight and nostalgia, I would take this any day over any modern X book in terms of storytelling, because at least Liddell gave a damn. And I'd like to know why he left. Like, from what I understand, 349 was his last book. And then when they did the trial of Gambit, it was a whole new writer. I was like, do you think he could have just hung on and at least finished what he started? But that's neither here nor there. If you guys know why he left the X books, let me know down in the comments. Speaking of, if you've enjoyed what you've seen and you want to read more about the trial of Gambit, please first and foremost support your local comic shop and see if you can get a copy of this book. If you've enjoyed this review, we really would appreciate if you take a moment to hit like, share, and subscribe. Helps the club channel more than you could possibly know. And if you don't mind hitting that fancy little X bell next to subscribe, that way as we continue to upload content, you guys get notified. Come to the channel, and we love talking with y'all and hearing your thoughts and feedback down in the comments below, or social media pages, which I'll make sure to leave the links down in the description. So with all that said, thank you so much for stopping by. Hope y'all continue to have an absolutely amazing day reading, and happy hunting, true believers.